Good afternoon. I hope everyone had a nice lunch and enjoyed the presentations this morning. My name is Matthew Forster. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Art History at Virginia Commonwealth University. I am pleased to introduce Ms. Newsha Tavakolian, an internationally renowned photojournalist and documentary photographer based in Iran. Ms. Tavakolian began her career at the age of 16 working at the women's daily newspaper Zan. Since that time, she has worked with international publications such as Time Magazine, National Geographic, and Der Spiegel. Her work places emphasis on regional political conflicts related to war and natural disaster. Her distinct documentary style also functions to dispel stereotypical visual representations of Iranian citizens, with a particular focus on women and youth. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Tavakolian for her talk titled "A Shah, a Russian, and My Grandfather: Iranian Photography, a History."
Hello. Thank you for having me here. At the end of the 19th century, Antoine Sevrigin, a Russian photographer living in Iran, was shooting in different parts of the country. He focused on everything: wealth, history, and also poverty. After coming to power, Reza Shah, a monarch in love with modernity and progress, confiscated Sevrigin's archive of negative glass plates. Reza Shah did not want any evidence or images showing the social and cultural poverty of Iran in that time. In other words, he didn't want to show the reality of the Iranian society. Instead, Reza Shah sought to construct a fantasy narrative of his time. The negative plates of Sevrigin were seized by Reza Shah's court, and his studio was set on fire during street fight. Sevrigin was one of the few photographers of his time who captured the evolving Iranian society in a great number of photos. From all those photos, only a few hundred frames survived. It was during the same era that Ismail Khan, a Kurdish nobleman, a teenager, was photographing his family with a camera he had bought from a foreign photographer in Iran. Ismail Khan took pictures of his uncle, his uncle's wife, and cousin. You can see the image. The photo that appears, at first it appears very simple, but if we look a bit more closely at the photo, we will find out more about the realities it shows. We see a Kurdish noble family dressed in Western clothing. At the same time, they wear Kurdish hats and shoes. In the background, one of the family attendants you can see standing behind her master with a hand on her chest in a servant pose. I am inspired by this photo. It serves as evidence of the existence of feudal and master-servant relations in Iranian society in that era. If we take a look at this photo in a metaphorical way, it is a good illustration of the interpersonal and social relations of that time. The nobleman is standing in the center of the photo with authority. He's holding his cane. He's the symbol of a male power in a society at the time. The man has put a hand on his daughter's shoulder as if he's dominating and controlling her. He leans on his cane with the other hand. The Western clothes worn by women, in contrast with the Kurdish headdress and shoes, is what I noticed first in this photo. If you look more carefully, note also the desolate expression on the face of the servant girl in the background, another sign of modernity in combination with dependence on a feudal tradition. It is through such evidence that in 2017 we can have a survey of that period and study its historical developments. Ismail Khan, our Nobleman teenager photographer, abandoned photography after a few years. As traditions prescribed, became a feudal lord. He had no other choice but to abandon photography. According to the beliefs of the time, it wasn't proper for a feudal lord to wield a camera. Khan abandoned photography, and today there is no more documentation at hand to study his life history or the history of his noble family. I mean, they must have been through many social and class-related ups and downs in the past century and a half. They must have experienced developments such as the Islamic Revolution, which since it was anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist, might have brought them from riches to rags. We don't know what happened to them. Half a century after Ismail Khan, I'm going to show you some images of Ismail Khan, the teenager nobleman. These images are from 145 years ago, from Kurdish part of Iran, and Ismail Khan was my great-great-uncle. Half a century after Ismail Khan, my grandfather, Mohammad Hossein Feizbakhsh, was born in Sanandaj. As a young man, he became interested in photography and bought a camera. At age 20, he found another love, my grandmother. She had a traditional strict family. They had one condition for the marriage, that my grandfather would abandon photography. People would think he was a bum in that time, with camera around his neck. My grandfather almost completely obeyed, but kept a secret camera taking snapshots of my grandmother and close friends. Whenever I see these images, my grandfather on a horse, a self-portrait of my grandmother wearing a hat, I see history. I'm sure at the time my grandfather wasn't thinking of history at all. I love this picture. It reminds me of Fellini's movies. A self-portrait. My grandmother. Capturing the realities of how we live help us understand who we were, what we've been, and who we are becoming. If only there had been more attention to the past, to what we now call social documentary photography, we would understand so much more from our past. Following the confiscation of Sevregin glass plates and burning down of his studio, social documentary photography in Iran was mostly ignored for decades. With the 60s and 70s, when Bahman Jalali, Kaveh Golestan, Nasrallah Kasaian, Maryam Zandi, and many others, the mother and father of Iran's social documentary photography, started taking up the cameras. During all those years in between, most photographers served as a seat of power by representing images favored by politicians. They helped fabricate the realities. Mind you, elsewhere in the world, social documentary photography was developing in a great speed. For decades, big events in Iran, whether in cities or in villages, whether in the streets or even in the privacy of homes, were ignored by photographers' eye. No visual documentation of that period is available, or if there is, it has not emerged. This is such a shame. We should blame the leaders of that time that didn't allow photographers to do their job. And this is such a shame for missing part of the history of our country. There's no documentation of that. The Islamic Republic in 1979 marked a tradition in documentary photography. Censors lost their grip and photographers took the street with their cameras capturing the events. While afterwards images were again controlled for 8 years of war with Iraq, provided space for photographers to capture the war. The Islamic Republic created an organization to document their vision of the war with Iraq. It sent photographers to front lines so that they could record events and battles, though those photos were used for propaganda at first. Today, 29 years later, those same photos serve as the documentation of a historical period. Also, as years passed, photographers started publicizing images the censors at the time hadn't allowed them to show. The revolution and war gave space to social documentary photographers to work. The circumstances were far from ideal, but better than the past. They improved further. As society pushed for change, photography followed. A decade after the 8 years of war with Iraq, with the reformist government of President Mohammad Khatami elected, the social and cultural atmosphere opened up. The Iranian press experienced a golden era, and many young photographers leaving universities were employed by newspapers. They were given platforms so previously they didn't have. A look at work from the period shows that most of the photos were influenced and determined by the main events of the time. Demonstration, changes, newspaper closure. The logic of the photos obeyed the logic of the events. And in their period, we no longer only witness fantasy images of the reality or images favored by the power that be. It is as if the photographers have developed a personal perspective, but this perspective is not mature yet. To me, this symbolizes an important trend toward independent photography. It is a trend that, unfortunately, it is on its way down in our region, but growing elsewhere despite many obstacles. Let's take a closer look home. Our region is in flames. The presence of social documentary photography in the Middle East, the theater of today's big crisis, is more needed than ever. Exactly now, we should capture reality so we can analyze it later. Social documentary photographers should be able to freely and without self-censorship and censorship by the institutions of power record their own time and surroundings. They should do so without endangering their physical safety or having to leave their countries or go to prison or face unemployment or even self-omission to immigrant to other genre of photography. So many times documentary photographers decided to become wedding photographers because it's more safe. At the same time, the number of photographers who fantasy the reality or staging photos is increasing. Let's imagine that we social documentary photographers would be able to show the reality or events in the Middle East. What destiny would await us? Consider the case of my young Iraqi colleagues, Ali Arkadi, who last year was photographing Iraqi security police instead of the usual subject of the ISIS. He wanted to show how they had taken up the habit of using force and violence, how they attack civilians and hurt them, what happened to the recorder of this reality that endangered the structure of the chaotic government. Ali was threatened to death and he and his family was forced to flee their country overnight. We look at some of Ali's work that he had to flee from Iraq. Innocent people. Let's imagine that we social documentary photographers would be able to show the reality or events in the Middle East. What destiny would wait for us? If Ali and other Alis were able to freely document the reality of what is happening in the Middle East, then years later, how would the head of the state to be remembered? I like to be realistic and also a dreamer at the same time, and I know nothing will change overnight. My own country, Iran, is a good example of how photographers have step by step tried to tell stories within the limits of what is possible. We use poetry. During the past 30 years, Iran's social documentary photography, influenced by cinema, had used poetic language as a channel for recording reality. In the past decade, after the events of the Green Movement in 2009, many photographers were either forced to leave the country or silence themselves. Some were jailed, so what solution remained to capturing the mood of those days? Some documentary photographers relied on a poetry and metaphor to show the angry and passive spirit of the time, using abstraction in their photography. In order to survive, they were forced to escape to abstraction from reality. This is work by Arash Faiz. It's where the demonstration happened in 2009 in Tehran. And he used the space images, and he marked with red the demonstration path where many people they were demonstrating. And then in a corner, this is one body of work, and in this picture is Polaroid image of the Freedom Tower in Tehran. This work is by Mehran Mohajer. He photographed the streets were empty for some time in Tehran after what happened. And this work is by Ali Musavi. It's a street of Tehran, and you see the big poster of a martyr that looking into the city. So in that time, many artists and many photographers, especially documentary photographers, they could not go on streets. So a camera became kind of like a spy equipment, and it was forbidden for some time to go out with a camera because they didn't want images to get out of in the world, images of what has happened in Tehran and many other big cities. And many photographers, the documentary photographers, they didn't work or they left the country. So it was very difficult time for documentary photographers who lived in Iran. For many centuries, the world has known Iran through the poetry of its great poet. Poetry has served as a medium for metaphoric articulation of what could not be said straightforwardly. Not only did poetry make us think, but it was also a secret language for criticism and warning. Poetry gave the opportunity to Iranians to express themselves and say through poetic language what they weren't able to say openly. Perhaps it is no accident that Iran is among countries with the most photographers. Today, when Iranians want to express themselves, they use a visual version of poetry, meaning photography. I did the same. I was doing social documentary photography in 2009. But like my other photographers' colleague, whenever there were ongoing protests in Tehran and other big cities, it was banned for documenting the events. I only had two choices, either to abandon photography altogether or to continue my work and change my style. But because documenting the time was the most important thing to me, I planned the Look project and turned my personal bedroom into a studio. I asked my neighbors to come and let me shoot their portraits. The shooting of this 10 portraits took almost 8 months because the people in front of my camera weren't themselves at first, and it took me months to try to take off their mask off. In that project, I wanted to represent a society in crisis, drowned in depression, whose circumstances were being affected under pressure from unemployment, internal oppression, and also outside pressure because Iran was in a heavy sanction in that time. I was one of the few photographers who succeeded in not being discouraged by those limitations. In Iran, we have an expression that says, if they block your nose, breathe through your mouth. The Look project for me was like breathing through my mouth in order to avoid death and continue living in my photography world. Inspired by the freedom of working without the rules of journalism, I continued in this field. Most recently, I have done a project capturing the undocumented lives of Iranians' middle-class youth. I called it Blank Pages of an Iranian Photo Album, recreating a photo album that I hope in some years will be seen as a historical documentation of Iranian society in that time. The goal of many photographers in recording moments is not documentation. I, for instance, wanted to bring a feeling across. It never occurred to me what a decade later it could also be seen as a capturing history. While in Iran and across the region, social documentary photographers are managing, despite all the obstacles, to tell stories, what continues to be missing are regional platforms. A place where our work is displayed and can be seen by an audience it meant for. Many of us in the region have to rely on the interest of Western art institutions and publications, as back home there is lack of interest in what we do. Some even start to cater to them instead of their home audience. Don't get me wrong, I praise such a magazine and institutions for having interest in work created in another culture and in another country. It shows a vision, unfortunately, not broadly shared in our region. What I like to see in our work also on display in our home countries, to be seen by Iraqis, Emiratis, Lebanese, Saudis, Qataris, and Afghans, and many others in the region. Because the message of locally made social documentary photography is firstly meant for them. True, there are art fairs and biennales in our region, but check how many documentary photography have been on display. Some might say there is not art. Documentary photography is not art. But globally, there is a growing realization among curators and social documentary photography requires just as much creativity as producing art. The lines defining the labels have long been blurred. Let's face it. Capturing what is around us is not popular in our region. There's a lot of ugliness. We would rather hide behind shiny things. I guess many try to escape from what they see, but don't forget, reality now is a history tomorrow. We need those platforms in our region. We should take recording what is happening now more seriously. We should collect and safeguard social documentary photography. I am hoping that one day we will see the establishment of a museum or center in our region that does exactly that. I'm proud that we have a Guggenheim in the Middle East, but can we please also have a place that gathers documentary photography and exhibit them and archiving them? That way, we can start building a collective memory, just as being done elsewhere in the world. A small country like the Netherlands have 3 photography museums in the museum. In the Middle East, there is only one, and it's Istanbul Photography Museum. As a result, most photographers in our region look forward to West. They go there to be trained and exhibited, but in the process, they are educated by eyes that view the world in a different way, which means many visiting students loses the part of their own identity. This is a blank pages of an Iranian photo album. What I did, I wanted to capture what the reality without interfering, without staging. But I'm very interested to see the photo album, the childhood photo album of people that I'm photographing, because it teaches me a lot about them, who they are, and the history of the family. So I'm very interested. And also because maybe I have a complex. I never had a photo album myself. My parents never made one for me because I was a second child. And 1 year after, my mother was pregnant with a boy. So that was the great thing in the family. So everyone focused on my brother. So I have only 3 or 4 pictures of mine when I'm a child. And this fascination, it's always, when I was taking picture of these 9 characters for my book, Blank Pages of an Iranian Photo Album, I asked them, they brought their childhood photo album. But what I realized was very interesting and common in all the photo albums, that these kids, when they were young, their parents, after a certain age, didn't capture or didn't added picture to their childhood photo album. So all of them, after 13, 14, their blank pages turned into a blank pages. That's why the idea came. And with my photographs, I try to continue the reality of who they are now to be added in their photo album. Ismail Khan, the Nobel teenage photographer that I showed you his images at first. Ismail Khan abandoned photography because of politics and patriarchy, and my grandfather did the same because of love and tradition. These same elements have caused them to put photography aside. In today's world, have transformed into tools for photographers to express their personal point of view. It seems that the same frame captured by Ismail Khan of his uncle and cousin and uncle's wife in 19th century might serve as a metaphor for what all of us Middle Eastern photographers have gone through in the past century and a half. Power in the center of our lives, and we have to find a way to deal with it. In conclusion, I would like to highlight the work of Kaveh Golestan, who died in Iraq in 2003. I want to end with this because what he did is exactly what I mean. Before the revolution, in 1979, he portrayed Iran prostitution area, but his images are back in 60s. His work was on display in Tehran University only for 2 weeks. After that, it was taken down as the ruler of the time didn't like it. Now, it's bought by the Tate Modern and have dedicated a permanent room for his series called Prostitute. Had Kaveh's work gone missing, there would be no documentation of that time. It would be as if there's never have been such a place. It would have been whipped from our collective memory, lost forever. Let's capture our reality for ourselves. Let's archive it so we can learn from our past. Thank you very much.